Now let's check on the patient, see how she's doing. She's in here for some major surgery. Fortunately, nothing in the engine bay, but you know, as if you saw the previous video, I suggest you watch it now if you didn't. But we're got this car in here for some suspension work. That's right, shocks for the rear. We're going to do the rear suspension and brakes. We don't need new brakes because, as you saw in the previous video, I checked the thickness with a caliper, a digital caliper, and they're fine. These are the original brakes, and they were actually still good. The rotors are still within spec. They can be machined for new pads, but I'm just going to replace the rotors and pads just because why not? These are bonded pads. So, I don't know, might as well just get it done while we're here. When you do repairs on cars, especially older vehicles, there are a lot of while we're here type repairs. And when you're doing rear suspension work, well, that's a biggie because you could replace bushings and all kinds of things until you're blue in the face, which is why it's important to make sure these parts are still serviceable now rather than find out that they're not later. Okay, before we do that, we're going to talk more about the bushings and the brakes and all that, but I want to talk about something that I found in this car that almost had me in tears. The R word. No, not that R word. That word that shall not be used. But the rust word. That's right. I thought for sure that I found a spot on this car that could turn severely cancerous. And after some poking and prodding and investigating and kind of thinking it over and doing some more poking and prodding and more thinking, I determined that there is no rust, but it caught me off guard. And I want to point this out because if you're working on an older vehicle like this, especially one that's in good condition, you want to watch out for things like this because, well, let's take a good look at it. Maybe we'll come up with our own conclusions. I'm putting pressure on this car. I probably shouldn't. It's on jack stands. But look down in that seam. You'll see some seam sealer. And you see what looks like iron oxide. That's what it looks like. But again, I poked and I prodded and I stuck my pick in there. And see, here's what happens on older vehicles and Subarus. Older vehicles and Subarus. Like apple pie and Chevrolet, they tend to rust in areas like that because what happens over time is this flexible body seam sealer. This is what it is. It's anytime they join panels together with pop rivets, with spot welds, they have to seal the seam with seam sealer that you can see. Okay, there's seam sealer both on the top and bottom on both sides of that seam, and it's supposed to keep water out. And it keeps water out, which keeps the rust away. And that's how it's supposed to work. But over time, that sealer can fail. It can lose its contact with the metal. It can lose its bond. And once moisture penetrates that barrier, it becomes a super highway for rust. And the areas in most vehicles that are more prone to this are in the wheel wells, especially on these old unibody cars. Now, if I scrape this stuff off, there's no rust behind it. What do I mean? Well, I'll tell you what I mean. What happens is, whenever you see brown, rusty substances near the seam sealer, it usually indicates that the body is rusting underneath it. And what can happen is that iron oxide, or that rust, which mixes with water, can actually soak into the seam sealer and cause it to discolor like this. Or if there's a leak, let's say there's a leak on this gas lid door. There isn't, but if there was, water can roll down that inner pinch weld area, or that inner panel, and it can collect in the seams, which can cause rust on the way, and that rust tracks down and pools into the lower spot. Now that's where tools like this lizard cam can come in handy. Don't buy this, by the way. This is a waste of money. This camera sucks. I mean, it is awful. You're better off using mirrors and flashlights to figure out what's going on. But you take that camera and you peer up inside there and you look inside the body cavity where you cannot access or see otherwise. And then you get a better picture of what's really going on. And what I found, which is really shocking given, again, the age of this car, but there was not even one instance or one speck of rust inside there. And then I looked down inside of that pinch weld, which is actually, let me just get my bearings here because there's a lot of pinch welds in this car. It should be this one right here. So the other side of that seam is right up in here. And what you're going to do is you're going to look for any rust tracks. So wherever there's a breach of seal between a pinch weld, it means water's getting in there. Okay, it means that it doesn't mean that the car is rotted out. It just means water has gotten in, breached that sealer, and you're going to find that there's going to be rust staining in the area. Okay, and I saw none. There's no rust staining of any kind. Now, the other way that can fail is if there's, let's say if there's moisture trapped in there for any reason. I don't think that's the case. I think what I'm seeing is a stain from some other source, because believe me, if there's rust on this car, I want to find it and I want to arrest it now. Because if you wait, and the problems can compound to the point where you're getting at it with angle grinders and replacement sheet metal. And it can happen fast when it starts. That's why these Miatas are so rust prone, because they weren't really built and rust proof from the factory to a point that, well, not like a modern car, that's for sure. But these early Miatas, they rust prolifically up in this area, and they rust down in here. They usually start rusting in the rocker panels once the drain holes get plugged for the convertible top. Once rust begins in the rocker panels and in the wheel arches, it's just, the car is a goner unless you fix it, unless you take it all apart and you remove the rust, you neutralize the rust, and then you rebuild. Another real problem spot for these cars is actually right up in here. And I've looked in there with a camera. I looked for any. What happens is debris, like leaves and pine needles, they run off of this tray here, down in here, right down in that channel there. So that is a drain, and that drains down behind the fender onto the ground, and that's where leaves and twigs and branches and shit build up, and they cause the water to dam. It causes moisture to stay there. So anytime you have any debris that locks in that moisture, the moisture just stays there and it eats away at the galvanized coating on the metal, and then once that's gone, boom, you've got rust. So like I said, when I saw that little spot there, I immediately got out my picks and my screwdrivers, and I started poking and looking for any crunchiness or weak areas, and there's nothing there. And as I'm scraping it away, it's going away. So there's nothing actively happening. If there were, I would actually start digging further and I would deal with it. But I think we're good. The car has never seen salt. So, again, New England roads, they're bad, especially in the wintertime. You take one of these cars out in the winter one time, and that salt gets, all that salt sprays up under the car. Let's say you take it out on the highway after, let's say it snows, they spread out this sodium chloride shit, and then, oh, you got a warm day out. It's late winter. It's a warm day. You've got an itch to scratch, and you've got to drive your classic car, your Miata, your Mustang, whatever it is. You take it out that one time, and then you park it in the garage and let it sit for another couple weeks. You're going to find a couple of things have happened. You're going to find that any cast aluminum components, valve covers, intake manifolds, they're going to start to corrode. You're going to find that any areas where there's scratches, like underneath the car, suspension components, they're going to rust. You do this enough times, and you've got a winter beater now. So it's important that if you have a car, you live in a northern state, that you keep it off the. If you have a car that you really want to preserve, a classic or a collectible, you definitely don't want to take it. You don't want to, unless there's ways to prevent it, and that is through fluid film or a similar oil-based underbody coating. You take fluid film and you spray it on everything under the car, and that won't happen. And then once you take it out that one time, you bring it to a car wash, you wash the motor off, you wash it, and then you put it in the garage, and you probably won't have a problem. Anyway, let's get now that we've discussed that issue to death, let's move on. We'll talk about the progress I'm making. Some of the parts that I've just ordered have come in. We'll talk about those, and that's coming right now. So, what do we got going on? So I want to do a quick kind of a mid-session update here on what's going on with the old Miata, and talk about a controversial subject. No, not that controversial, but pretty controversial. Sorry. So, let's get into it. All the suspension, underbody, everything has been undercoated. And it was coated when I bought the car, but not completely. I kind of finished the job. There was no rot, no real rust or anything. But generally, these suspension parts are painted at the factory with the cheapest paints imaginable. They flake off. There will be, and there was, a little bit of surface rust in a few areas. And what I did was I just said, screw it. I covered the whole thing with this rubberized undercoating. I've used this on almost all of my cars with success. And another controversial subject is hanging calipers by brake hoses. It's not recommended. I just got lazy. I'll be straight with you there. I just got lazy, and I'm hanging them by the hoses. But these hoses are so freaking strong, I don't think I'm hurting them. And another thing is, if they break or if they crack, just by being suspended like that, then they needed to be replaced in the first place. So I'm not too concerned. But there's a lot of folks who despise this stuff. And I have a feeling that it's because, all right, some of the they're dealer-installed undercoatings, which aren't this, but they're a much thicker, much sloppier product, and they can encase nuts and bolts, and they tend to trap in salt and sand and moisture. And those kinds of coatings, like Z-Bart, for example, they can cause damage. They can cause more damage than they solve. In fact, they're probably something you should never put in your car because they're applied so thick. And the dealer does it in a way that they just spray it everywhere, and it can block drain channels and cause corrosion. This car is a little bit different. This car will never see a salty road and never has in its life, and it never will. And for that, that's the only reason this car is still in the condition it's in. Because it hasn't been used or driven on a salty New England road ever. And I can tell when a car has seen even one winter. I've been around New England cars enough to know that, you know, even my Hyundai Santa Fe right there, which is only about 4 years old now, I can tell it's been through some salty roads in its life, and it's just really obvious. But this one hasn't, you know. So that's controversial issue number one. Number two, I want to, before I dive in, you know, let's get to this one first. My brake calipers are original, never replaced, never needed to be, but they were starting to look a little knackered. No, that's not the word. A little ratty. The fact, see, these were unpainted at the factory. Normally, brake calipers will develop a light coating of rust. That is pretty normal, especially in New England, especially after 25, 26 years. These calipers didn't have any rust on them at all, but they were a little bit, let's just say, not the most photogenic things in the world. Well, let me show you what I mean. I haven't taken the front calipers off, so let's see what they look like. This is what they look like. Just gray cast iron, which is what they're made of. So I decided to go ahead and just give them a coating of caliper paint. This is a special paint for brake calipers. It's basically engine paint. I don't know if it's much different than engine paint. Basically the same product, but it withstands heat and, they claim, certain chemicals, but brake fluid eats through anything, so I'm going to say, you know, that's bullshit. But what I'm going to do, you'll notice I got paint on the rubber boots. We're going to replace those. These are the caliper guide pin boots. These probably should be replaced from time to time because as they get older, they don't really do a great job of sealing water out from the guide pin sockets. And the grease that's supposed to be in there, you know, it leaks out. So we're going to put a new set of boots on there. This caliper is going to look like it just came out of the box when I'm done with it. Normally you would actually take the calipers off the car if you're going to paint them. That is probably the right way to do it. I've opted not to do that because I don't want to open the hydraulic system and I don't want to have to bleed the brakes. Bleeding brakes is one thing that I just don't do very well, and, well, I don't want to cause more work for myself. But I think I did an alright job of not getting paint where it doesn't belong and getting it where it does. Moving along. Okay. These came. So I actually placed multiple orders for different things. I got orders for brakes and suspension mounts. I got another order for shocks, and yeah, it's a whole big thing. But these are the new mounts, the new shock mounts. These are actually on the Miata. They're the same mount front and rear, as far as I know. They're the same exact mount. So this car uses 4 of these, which is kind of cool. It makes it a little easier to order parts. But yeah, I do believe that the shock mounts are the same front and rear, which is really strange. You'd think they'd be different. But let me just show you some of the degradation that's occurred. So these are a brand new mount, and if I squeeze as hard as I cannot get this thing to deflect. The rubber is really, really, really hard. Here's the original one. And without very much effort at all, it deflects. So that brings up an interesting point. If the shock mounts are degraded to that point, what about the rest of the suspension bushings? And honestly, you know, they probably should be replaced. They probably should. I mean, they're supposed to move like that. That's what they're supposed to do. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But newer ones would be a little bit firmer, for sure. You know, I mean, really, it's an individual. It's your call as the car owner whether or not to do them. I don't want to go off and buy replacement bushings that aren't going to last as long as these did. See, here's the thing. Okay, so let's take a look at the So it's pretty obvious to any viewer that replacing the suspension bushings in the rear would be the time to do it. Absolutely 100%. This would be the time, because the car is going to be laid up for several months while it sits in this garage, and you know, if you're going to do something like new bushings, this is the time. But I don't really intend to do that. I have no intention of replacing these bushings right now because they're not bad. They're not new, they're not great, but they're not bad. If I were going to track this car, oh, I'd be ripping this all apart right now. I'd be tearing all of this apart. And I would actually have to buy an arbor press so I could push all these bushings are actually pushed in with a press, so you've got to push them out with a press and then use a press to put the new ones in once you get the the control arms off, the upper and lower control arms. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and I just don't want to do it. I'm just going to be honest. I'm going to level with you folks. I don't want to do it. If these were bad and they were broken, yeah, I'd be doing it. I'd be tearing them out, because that's just what you have to do. Another important note to make while we're at this stage: when we reassemble everything, hopefully in the next video, I'm hoping to get the parts in this week and the rest of them, and we'll get it reassembled. But in our next video, when we do that, when you do all that, we're going to have to preload the suspension before we start tightening things down. That is something a lot of people don't really think about if they're doing this for the first time. They just put it all back together again, tighten everything up, put the wheels on, drop the car on the ground, and go for a cruise. But what you're doing, if you do it that way, is you're actually running the risk of shredding the new bushings that you just put in. The bushings are supposed to be, if you don't know, these are rubber bushings here, 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 and here, plus the ones that are on the anti-roll, the stabilizer bar, links, the bar itself, and the shock mount down here. All of those bushings are supposed to be tightened down when the suspension is at its rest position. That being that the car, when it's on its laden position. So that is wheels on the ground, car jacked, are off the blocks. That's when you tighten all of those parts, because the suspension bushings are two pieces. There's a center steel core and a rubber outer bushing. And the steel core and the bushing are bonded together. And once they're... a good example of this would be to show you what I mean. So a good visual of this is, let's say when the car is parked on the ground and everything is tightened down, this is how it sits. Okay, my fingers represent the stabilizer bar or some fictitious suspension component. Now, when I go to jack the car up, okay, it's gonna drop down a little bit, like that, and then I loosen the bolt. It goes like that. Okay. Now let's say I put the new stabilizer bar link in there. I tighten it down. Now, all that, let's say it's tightened down. Now it's in it's jacked up off the ground, and it's like this. So I go to tighten that bolt up. Now I go to lower the car. It's going to want to go like this. Okay. So what that does is it stresses the bushing in a way that it wasn't designed to. So when I go to do this correctly, I'm going to leave the bolts loose. I'm going to lower the car, or I'm going to not actually lower the car down. I'm going to show you what I mean in a second. We're not going to actually lower it down before we tighten these. There's a way around this. When I lower it down, it's going to want to go like this. Okay, great. Now I tighten it up. So what that does is it gives the bushing some travel either way. Or it keeps the tension neutral, so that when you're driving along the road, the tension is negative and then positive and then negative and then positive, and that's how it's supposed to work in harmony, right? Does any of that make sense? It makes sense in my head, but I'm trying to convey it in a way that probably is confusing the hell out of you guys, but I'm sure most of you get what I'm trying to say. What you have to do during reassembly is you can leave the car on jack stands, but you take your trolley jack and then you jack the control arm up until it starts to lift the car. So you want to mimic the position that it will be in when the car is parked on the ground. So you're going to lift the control arm up from the bottom. You're not going to put enough tension on it to lift it off the jack. Don't do that. That would bring you into a world of hurt, because then you can destabilize the car because it's sitting on 2 jack stands. You don't want to destabilize the car. Now, once you do that, you lift this up, get everything into the right position, as if it were parked in your driveway, and then tighten everything down to torque specs, and then undo the jack, and then let everything kind of drop down as it's supposed to. That is how you do it. I've had to do this before. I did this on a 2010 Hyundai Elantra. The car had just 70,000 miles on it, and I needed to replace my control arm bushings. Actually, in the front, I ended up putting a brand new set of control arms with the bushings pre-installed, and I then got rid of the car about 25,000 miles later. But I've had to do this before, so I know what I'm getting into. But you can't just tighten everything down when it's on jack stands and expect it to be okay. Here's what could happen. Let's say we loosen the control arms, okay, those right there. We loosen those right up, and we tighten it up, because right now they're under tension. They're under a lot of tension because they're holding the weight. They're holding the weight of all this, the hub assembly. Let's say I loosen these up. It's going to drop down a little bit. And then I tighten these right up. Just torque them right up. And then I put the wheels on, I put the shock in, da-da-da-da-da. I'm driving down the road. What's happening now is I am putting an excessive amount of tension on, or torsion on these bushings, more than they were ever designed for. And I then would run the risk of a bushing separation problem or just outright failure. So we don't want that. As I stated earlier, the suspension, the shock mounts have come in, but I've also got the new dog bones. This is how they come. These are from TRW. TRW is just an OEM part supplier for many manufacturers. These, if you cross-reference the part number on these, I believe these also fit a Nissan Maxima, a fairly recent one actually. One of the things you got to realize that in the auto parts world, a lot of parts get reused between manufacturers. Parts like, what the hell is she doing? Oh, my clock is wrong. We have to go. Crap. I got to finish up. All right. So these dog bones could fit other makes and models. So a lot of these parts get used across multiple manufacturers. These shock mounts are probably used on many other cars. And what that does for you, the consumer or the owner of an older car, is it means that a lot of these parts will be available for many years to come, because they don't have to be changed all that much in the course of designing new products or new vehicles. But I found that some of the parts I ordered for this car, one of them cross-referenced to a, and I think it was the shock boots and stops. The bump stops, I believe, also fits like a late model Maxima. So that is kind of interesting to find out that your car is actually not as weird and unique. Anyway. But brake pads, brake drums, parts like that are, again, often used, just like tires, are often available or cross-referenced to other makes and models from a variety of manufacturers. So, these are the new stabilizer bar bushings. And we'll compare them to the old ones real quick. I just stuffed them on the dog bones. I'm calling them dog bones because they look like dog bones. Let's take these off here. So these have 26, 27 years of being under tension. These do not. You can see that the hole is a little bit rounded, a little bit worn out on the old ones. So that'll probably firm up the stabilizer bar a little bit. Doesn't need it, but the stabilizer links are actually fine. These are the originals. They're no good. But you can see, like this one right here, looks like there might be some cracking going on the rubber. But by no means, if I were to have this job done at a suspension shop, there's no way these would need replacement. They're perfectly fine. But we're replacing all these parts because I feel that it's just the right thing to do when you're in it this far. And I don't want to go as far as to start replacing, the major bushings, because they are still good. There's no need at this point to replace them. So we got all those in. One more thing.